Healthcare and senior care is fraught with problems and challenges, but we're also seeing some amazing new clinical treatments and resources. This show will help illuminate and uncover the good, bad, and the ugly in order to equip patients, families, and other healthcare providers. Welcome to Senior Care Confidential.
Hi, everybody. It's a great day. We are so excited to be here. Hello, Brian.
Hello. Good
to see you. And we have lots to talk about. We have a great show. So we're just going to we don't want to discuss politics. We are a healthcare show, but COVID, as we know, is always on the news. And there's been lots of media buzz lately on the origin of COVID, the virus that has claimed nearly 7 million lives, which is so hard to believe. There have been that many deaths with COVID. Dr. Robert Renfield, the former director of the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, testified how science indicates that COVID-19 was likely the result of an accidental lab leak in Wuhan. His conclusion was based on the biology of the virus itself and unusual actions in and around Wuhan in 2019. So, Brian, what are your thoughts on that?
So I'll avoid the landmines and I'll just say clinical research is vital. And I think it's healthy in any kind of a particularly science fields and in our world, you know, the healthcare field, to have hearty debates on all sides. And if we're finding that there are research projects or evidence-based, projects that are revealing whatever on both sides, I think that those are important to have discussions on and not. I don't like the term "the science is settled" because science is never settled, because our understanding of science and God and how things fit together seems to be constantly evolving as we get smarter. And so I think having hearty debates on both sides is useful and valid and necessary.
Absolutely. Yeah. And my son's a physician and he's like, "Mom, I am practicing medicine.
That's right.
I'm not an expert. I'm practicing."
There was an interesting, I think they talk about it in med schools, and it's something, I may misquote it, but it's something like, the things that we believe to be true today, in 20 years, like 80% of them will be found to be false. So if our understanding of science and the body and medicine is evolving that quickly, then maybe we shouldn't, dig our heels in so much on some things that we may not agree with.
Well, and you think about Ebola. Ebola was in Dallas about 10, 11 years ago. And I remember the hospital where they felt it originated it shut down. Nobody even drove around that area of the city. People were terrified. So, and now we know, we have the information we need on that. But anyway, today we have a very special guest. She is a registered nurse. She is an infectious disease nurse, and she is also a successful author. Amanda Skenandore used her knowledge in researching historical diseases to write several best-selling novels based on diseases that crippled the country so many years ago. We are talking about her book, The Second Life of Muriel West. I'm so excited to talk to Amanda. She is just this book is just amazing. I could not put it down. So just to share with Amanda, I grew up in New Orleans. My grandmother was an actual retired charity nurse. She had a Red Cross cape. I still have the cape today in a frame. I'm so proud of that cape. And growing up in New Orleans, this was in the 60s, my grandmother would take my brother and sister and I to nursing homes in New Orleans, and we would visit these. They would call them the homes for the incurables. These people had no family.
Such an awful term.
It's so horrible. And I even went by years later just to get some information, and they kind of slammed the door in my face. So I think it's just a bad black cloud that follows them around. But anyway, my sister and I are both RNs today, and a lot of it was because we learned so much. And just saw the need in caring for people. And I loved that. But I remember stories that my grandmother would share about Carville and the Catholic nuns who devoted their lives to caring for patients afflicted with leprosy, which is now called Hansen's disease. So we want to talk to Amanda. Amanda, welcome. We're so glad you are here with us today. And just let's talk about the book.
Yeah. Welcome, Amanda. Thank you. It was a wonderful book.
Thank you so much for having me.
Amanda, I told you before we started that I'm in a book club and I've got serious readers. And we meet monthly, and not once in the last 3.5 years has everyone liked a book. They are always complaining about the book. This is the first time that we had a unanimous high five. This is the best book we've ever read. I love to read, and I love the kind of books that are so interesting that you cannot put down.
Yeah.
And this is one of them, and I've loved it. And I'm so honored. We are so honored that you're here to talk about your book. So here we go.
Yep. So how did you decide to write a book on leprosy? Like, this is a biblical type of disease that would be terrifying back in the day. And now, there's a book that's, highlighting a real case study in a sense of what it would have been like to have been afflicted with this, and everything that goes into the society being terrified of this disease. How infectious is it? How likely is our kids and our spouses will get this? The neighbor, the drinking fountain that we may share with, all these things all kind of rolled up into one story behind Miss West.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that really sort of touches on why I chose to write the book, because I very much had a similar sense of leprosy as this, biblical affliction, something from the past and, long ago times and faraway places. And I was thinking about ideas for a new story. And I was at the university library here in Las Vegas, where I live. And I came across this tiny book. It was called Remembering Leprosy in America, Carville, Remembering Leprosy in America. And, I pick it up and I think, what? Leprosy in America?
Right.
I had never even known that it was a disease that had ever been endemic here in the United States. So I take the book and I kind of go to this corner of the library and I read it cover to cover. And I was really shocked, for lack of a better word, by three things. One, by how little I knew about the disease. And two, by how much of what I thought that I knew about the disease was actually wrong. And three, I think most importantly, was the degree to which the stigma of the disease really affected the patients' lives, and not only their lives, but the lives of their families, and how it really drove this sort of tragic situation where people with the disease were quarantined either in a facility like Carville or before Carville in pest houses or isolation wards, sometimes for their entire lives. And I thought, if I had all these misconceptions and misunderstandings about the disease, maybe other people here might as well. And maybe there's a story to tell and a way to bring these people's experience to light.
So, Amanda, are your characters based on true people?
My characters are all fictitious. They're creations of my imagination, but all of the experiences that they have, the situations that they go through, all of that were drawn from my research. So they were things, again, situations, experiences that people with the disease in the 1920s, in and around that time, people at Carville did in fact experience.
Yeah, I get it's flashbacks. What was the movie? It was probably 20 years ago. Outbreak or something. Remember it was the monkey. Remember they were going house to house with the vans to round these people up. That was the imagery as I was reading the book, at least on the early goings, the first few chapters where Miss West is being essentially ushered out of a hospital. She's being quarantined in a hospital. They're taking her, her husband is, I don't want to give too much of the book away, but her husband's a well-to-do, very famous person. And so they're trying to keep her and his identities concealed. And they're whisking her away in some ambulance, rickety ambulance to, a train where they're living like amongst, hay or whatever it was, all the way from California to New Orleans. And you just get these images of the internment and the loss of freedom, not the almost, but for sure the loss of freedom that these people had because of a disease that we didn't fully understand.
And too, what I loved, I thought was so interesting in the boxcar, where she goes in the boxcar and the nurse that's there. I mean, that nurse has jeopardized her life. Yeah. I mean, because you have her, she has a 3-legged stool to sit on. That the nurse taking care of them is not taken care of.
Right.
There are no bathrooms. It was so cute how she says, I'm going to go to the dining train and get something to eat. Oh, no, you're not. So how did you do your research other than you had that little book, but where did you go from there?
Yeah, so I think that book was just sort of the eye-opener moment for me, right? And then I realized, one, I needed to learn more about the disease. So I spent time understanding our modern day, present day knowledge of the disease, but also I wanted to know, what did the doctors and scientists and nurses know in the 1920s, because that's when the book is set. As you alluded to, there's Muriel, the main character. She's the wife of a silent film star, and she unexpectedly contracts the disease and is whisked away to the National Leprosarium in Louisiana, which was called Carville. Mm-hmm. And there she has to sort of grapple with both the disease itself, as well as this very crippling stigma that follows the disease, and somehow try to find a way to make a new life for herself. So that's a little bit of a background about the disease. So I needed to understand leprosy, again, as they understood it in the 1920s, because that's when the book was set. But most of my research came from a trip that I took to Louisiana, to Carville. It is no longer a hospital. The disease is now treated completely via outpatient, but there's a museum there. And Carville, for those of you who are familiar with Louisiana, it's sort of in between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, right along the Mississippi. And at this museum, they have a wonderful archive. So I spent 4 days there researching in the archive, touring the museum. I also got to tour around many of the structures that are still standing that were there. There's a cemetery that they did. Yeah.
Just crazy.
Just so much.
Yeah. So when you even saying it's a hospital, it was a hospital, but it was really a prison sentence. Like, they literally had a fence with barbed wire keeping these people in.
Well, and my grandmother, just back in the day, or 30s and 40s, she worked she called it a sanatorium. So that's where the insane, she took care of the insane. That's what she would say. I know. So things have really changed and come a long way. Thank goodness.
You mentioned that you had to research leprosy back from our understanding of the disease back in the 1920s. So I have two questions on that. One, how did it get changed from leprosy to Hansen's disease? Like, how did that happen? Because it obviously changes the stigma. If you're walking around going, I got diagnosed with leprosy the other day, people are going to stay away from you. It's much more favorable to say, I have Hansen's disease. So why did they change the name? And then what's the presentation and what's the treatment look like today versus 100 years ago?
Yeah, that's I think you really hit it correctly, Brian, when you're talking about the stigma. That's entirely why the name was changed. And it was a patient at Carville. His name was Stanley Stein. And he and other patients, both at Carville and around the world, they really lobbied to get the name changed because of the incredible stigma that follows the disease.
Okay.
Wow.
It very much is different when you say this person has Hansen's disease, when you say, oh, this person has leprosy. The moral weight, I think, that was attached to the disease is no longer there, thank goodness. In terms of the treatment and the differing treatments, so in the 1920s and before, this was before they had discovered penicillin, antibiotics, right? And so they were trying everything. They tried vaccines, they tried milk injections, they tried plant extracts, fever therapy, which is something I sort of go into in the book. And again, you just had all of these patients who, like you said, Brian, they were not just patients, but they were prisoners. Mm-hmm. And so they really had vested interest, right, in finding a cure. And they were
down to solitary confinement prisoners, by the way.
Right,
like
yes.
That was shocking to me. They literally were treated like prisoners. So I completely understand why you would want to change the stigma in the name of the disease. So, kudos to Mr. Hansen for wanting to change and named after him. Terrible. So how is the treatment of leprosy or understanding the disease different today? Like, is the bug the same as it was back in the 20s, or has that evolved? Sorry. Yeah.
No, I apologize. First, I want to say so that the Hansen's disease actually comes not from the person, Stanley Stein, who advocated for the name change, but from a Dr. Hansen from Norway. He was the scientist who discovered the bacteria.
Okay, gotcha.
And it is the same bacteria from the 1920s as today. But today, of course, we have antibiotics. So now it's treated completely outpatient. There's no quarantine involved at all. And patients will get a fairly long course of antibiotics, usually a cocktail of 3 antibiotics over the course of 1 to 2 years.
Wow. Okay. And so I read that there are over 200,000 cases annually. And so what is I don't know if you could say how you catch leprosy or Hansen's disease, what would you say the answer would be?
Well, so first, to begin with, there are about 200,000 cases annually, but in the United States, it's much less. We're talking maybe 100 to 200 cases, new cases diagnosed every year.
Oh, wow.
Unfortunately, yes. So the very, very little transmission here, but worldwide in particular places, India, other places in East Asia, Brazil have higher rates of transmission. And they believe that the disease is actually spread by respiratory droplets, so similar to the flu.
It seems like because we only have 100 to, and we have a large population here, but only 100 to 200 cases, it seems like, is there some correlation between like a first world country and our understanding of hygiene and those kind of things that helps to keep us more safe from this versus some of the other countries that you see it popping up in?
I think more than hygiene, because again, I think that's this part of the vestige of our prior understanding of the disease, right? That it was a disease.
So I'm leading more into the
by
stigma
contact,
again.
right?
My fault,
by touching, by a lack of cleanliness.
Yeah.
And that's really not the case in terms of the transmission of the disease.
Okay.
But I think what it is access to the antibiotics, access to the care, and still a lingering sense of stigma. So when patients are afraid to admit that they have the disease, when they know that they and or their families are going to be unfairly and harshly treated because of that diagnosis, I think they're less likely to access the care, even though the care we have now, the antibiotics, is so effective. And so that's why I believe you're seeing transmission in some of these other places. And I will say as well that I don't know that the transmission in the United States, well, it was endemic in the United States, in particular in certain states, Louisiana, for example, it was never quite as, I think, a prevalent as disease as you might have seen somewhere else.
Gotcha. Okay.
So, being from Louisiana and New Orleans, I remember River Road. I know which road you're talking about. You drive past the levee and you can get to Baton Rouge from New Orleans. It's just, I used to ride my bike on the levee and just so many memories as a child. But how did they pick Carville? Why Carville, Louisiana?
What happened was in the late 1800s, the 1890s, Louisiana, there was actually kind of an expose in the newspaper in New Orleans that talked about some of the people with leprosy that were being kept just in various pest houses around the city. And there was this great outcry, like, oh my goodness, you have to move these people outside of the city limits, because again, there was so much fear and misunderstanding about the disease. And so the state sort of took notice of that. And what they did is they bought this old plantation that, was right there along the River Road. And they told the people surrounding that area that they were going to build an ostrich farm, because they didn't want those people to get up in arms about having people with the disease close by. And then they gathered up all the people in the city in New Orleans that had the disease and brought them on a barge at nighttime to what would be Carville, essentially, which is actually just that tiny little town that's right next to this area. And for, I think, about 25 years, it was just a home / hospital, but mostly just a home for people in Louisiana who had the disease. And, as you mentioned, Joe, the Daughters of Charity came, and they were the nurses there. There were no other nurses that were willing to take care of these patients. And so the Daughters of Charity came and took care of these patients. But then in the 1920s, there was a man named John Early who had the disease. Actually, this was in the 19 teens when this happened. And he his experience was similar to other people's in that he had the disease. He would get kind of taken by the public health department and locked away. He would escape. He was the breadwinner for his family, so he was trying to provide for them. And he just this would happen over and over again. He would escape. They would capture him again, lock him away. And finally he escaped and he went to Washington, D.C., and he rented a room in a very fancy hotel where several other legislators stayed. And he stayed there for 3 days, called the press at the last day and said, my name is John Early. I have leprosy and I have been staying at this hotel. And if the laws are going to say that people like me, people with this disease, are going to be locked away, you have to have a national home for us, a place where we can all go and get some sort of real care. And so again, you had all these legislators that stayed at this hotel, and they were terrified that, oh my goodness, maybe I've caught this disease. How can we have people like this, running free? And that really spurred them to create a national leprosarium, they called it. And they chose Carville because Carville was already in existence. And so in the early 1920s, patients from all over the rest of the country were sent to Carville, where they were forced to remain until either they were deemed cure and no longer what they would call a nuisance to the public health, or until they died.
Wow.
Goodness gracious. So I imagine is your I don't affinity is probably the wrong word, but your attraction to this kind of a story, is it largely because you are an infectious disease nurse yourself?
I certainly think that's part of it. Yes.
Okay.
I think, I'm very interested in disease transmission. And also I think the way that some, as you were talking about in the beginning, how sometimes what we know today is not what we're going to know in 20 years. And, I think that there's a cautionary tale in that.
Yeah. Okay. What's the bigger message you hope to get across through this book?
So one of the reasons I write historical fiction and I love historical fiction is because I feel like there's so much relevance that we can glean in our modern lives from the past. And that to me was certainly true when I read about the patients who were, again, as you mentioned, essentially imprisoned at Carville for decades. I think too, more recently with the AIDS crisis, especially in the 1980s, when there was so much stigma that people attached to that disease and so much fear. But even more recently, you have situations, there was some of that, of course, with COVID. With mental health, there's still a lot of stigma and moral weight attached to that, body size. So I think there are things today where we are unfairly making assumptions about people who have illnesses when, again, like with leprosy, these things, they're medical diagnoses, they're bacteria, they're viruses. Yep. They're not a symbol that this person is a bad or immoral person. Mm-hmm. And so my hope was sort of, that people would read the book and maybe I just look with a little bit more kindness and
stop
compassion.
Dehumanizing.
Yes. Yeah. So what are you working on now? What's yet to come? I
just started working on a book. I do really enjoy kind of exploring medical history. So I'm writing a book about a woman physician in 1900. So right when you started to see women becoming doctors. But this particular woman, she is at the brink of ruin. And so she is lured into joining a snake oil salesman and his traveling medicine show. And they travel, the way that these shows did, all around, rural America, hawking their cure-all potions and other, elixirs. And they wind up in Galveston, Texas, right on the eve of the terrible hurricane that they had in 1900. That was the worst natural disaster in terms of loss of life that we've had in the United States.
Oh, that is awesome. Well, we have some books that I just want to show the listeners. The Nurse's Secret. This is going to be fabulous. I cannot wait to read this. The Undertaker's Assistant is another one. These are all by Amanda. Between Earth and Sky. These all look, and I was able to buy these on Amazon as a set with a little bit of a discount, which was wonderful. And then, of course, the book we're talking about today, The Secret Life of Muriel West. Yep. Just so great. So other than Amazon, where can we get your books?
The books are available really wherever books are sold. So if you have an independent bookstore in your town, you can go. They may have it on the shelf, but they can certainly order it if they don't. Barnes & Noble, if you're an e-reader or an e-book reader, of course, you can get it on Amazon, but also Barnes & Noble, Nook, and Kobo as well.
And, I want to say one more thing, Amanda. I wrote a book too. I wrote a memoir, and it was about my childhood in New Orleans. It did not become a bestseller. But what I loved is that it took you 5 years. I love to read that your husband encouraged you, and it took 5 years to get a publisher. Is that right?
Yes, it's actually took a little bit longer than 5 years. I had this crazy idea that I would write this book, and that then people would just be knocking on my door like, I would like to read this book. And of course, that's not how it happened. And so I had told him, I think it'll take about a year, but I ended up writing a book that, never sold, that's just in a drawer here in my office. And, but I kept going, and he was incredibly supportive, as the years kind of ticked by and I still hadn't found a publisher yet.
Wow, that's neat. Well, there's so many wonderful books, and you hear stories like that, like Harry Potter. I think she was declined 67 times, something like that. And just took forever. And what was the other? The Help. That author. It took just dozens of tries to get somebody to take on her book. So anyway, so excited for you. And you're just doing something you love to do. I just love encouraging female authors and entrepreneurs, and just way to go, because it's great.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you so much for joining us today. The book is fascinating. I really appreciate the putting the human factor into these characters, especially Miss West, as she's going through all this stuff. It really, when you think of leprosy in this context, this is like we talked about before, it's like a biblical plague. Like, this is the hand of God striking you. And so for 6,000 years of recorded history, we've looked at leprosy as this thing of, oh my gosh, like, we can't be around you, and the effect that it has on individual patients and families. And we seem to be making these mistakes
I know.
on a regular basis, unfortunately. So I so appreciate you bringing that to light and writing this story and letting us interview you today.
Yeah. Thank you, Amanda, so much. And you have a great day. We appreciate you. We appreciate your time.
I appreciate what you guys are doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.